Hi, everybody. Welcome to Literature Out Loud. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that I'm here, and I'm glad that Morgan Walsh is here. We're going to bring you some great stories by the author Curtis Sittenfeld, who is at this point really a very popular author, has been featured in a whole lot of magazines and has written a boatload of books and has been recognized for her talent wildly. I'm going to be reading a piece that's a little bit shorter called Bad Latch, which you will have to imagine that I'm a little bit younger than I am. Although I'm just, used hard. I'm really 27 years old. And Morgan, don't you be laughing. And Morgan, who is
Well,
a
me too.
wide,
I was just thinking, what a coincidence.
we both are. Well,
Yeah.
and Morgan is going to be reading this great piece from, it was published in the New Yorker called A for Alone, which features not only people trying to make up their own minds, but trying to decide about Billy Graham and, that late
Mike
vice
Pence.
president of ours, Mike Pence. So I think they're both going to be pretty enjoyable for you. I hope so. And we are, as always, eternally indebted to Sean Jeffries and the lovely people at Thunder River Theater, as well as the people at Pitkin County Library. And I hope you enjoy the works of Curtis Sittenfeld. Here we go. See you later, Morgan. Here we are. Bad Latch, from a book called You Think It, I'll Say It by Curtis Sittenfeld. Of the 10 of us enrolled in the prenatal yoga class that summer at the Y, I was the second most pregnant, and the woman who was the most pregnant was named Gretchen. All of us sat on oversized rubber balls, and Gretchen always staked out the center of the front row closest to the instructor. The first class, when we were supposed to go around and say our name, due date, whether we knew it was a boy or a girl, and where we were planning to deliver, she said August 18th. My due date was August 29th, and added, Carl and I want to be surprised about the gender because in our information-saturated world, it's nice to still allow for some mystery and magic, right? She'd turned around on her balls so that she was facing those of us in the second and third rows, and she smiled self-congratulatorily. She had a high brown ponytail and wore mint green tank top that stretched over her belly and cost $62, which I knew because I'd seen it at a maternity boutique full of clothes I couldn't afford. We're delivering at home with a midwife, Gretchen continued, drug-free and all that. And then I'll be a stay-at-home mom because it's like, if you're going to outsource your children, why even bother to become a parent in the first place? Lest it seem like this class occurred in a place where you could get away with saying such things, Brooklyn maybe, or Berkeley, it didn't. It occurred in Omaha, Nebraska, and I heard Gretchen repeat her comments verbatim. Carl, information saturated, mystery, magic, home birth, drug-free, outsource, every Saturday morning for the next 5 weeks because the instructor liked us to reintroduce ourselves each time. The sixth class, Gretchen wasn't there. Her absence meant that when we discussed which parts of our bodies were newly sore or swollen, a discussion Gretchen had consistently dominated, my concerns took precedence over everyone else's. At the end of class, as we lay under nubbly Mexican blankets while the instructor guided us on a visualization of our peaceful, joyous deliveries, I wondered how Gretchen's home birth had gone. Or perhaps she was in labor at that very moment, simultaneously snacking on organic trail mix and breathing mindfully as stalwart Carl massaged her hips. As for me, at the grocery store, strangers would look at my belly and say, oh, any minute now. Then at 5 a.m. on a hot Thursday, after a bunch of contractions, an epidural, a lot of pushing, and a lot more pushing, she arrived. We had known in advance that she'd be a girl, and we decided on calling her Sadie. Everything about her was otherworldly and astonishing. Her eyes were big and brown, her nose was tiny and upturned, and her mouth was set in a nonplussed purse. "She looks mad," I said. And my husband, Adam, who was choked up, said, "We have a daughter." It was a month later that I saw Gretchen again, this time at the weekly breastfeeding support group hosted by the maternity boutique whose clothes I couldn't afford. By then, Sadie was sleeping at night in a carpeted cat box between Adam and me, and we'd removed everything but the fitted sheet from our bed, all in an effort to get some rest while not smothering her. Also, I was finding nursing unbearable. The moment of her clamping on was like someone biting your skinned knee, and whenever she turned her head toward my chest, rooting, I was filled with dread. Intermittently, I'd place huge green cabbage leaves on my boobs between my bra and skin, a recommendation I'd read on a website, though I'd yet to experience any decrease in soreness. Adam had returned to his office a week after Sadie's birth. I, meanwhile, would have a 3-month maternity leave before resuming my job 4 days a week, one of which I'd work from home. On the days I couldn't be with Sadie, Adam's mother would come to our house to babysit. Although my job was considerably less cool than what I'd once imagined doing with my life. My employer was a multinational food manufacturer that, as it happened, was the #1 seller of infant formula, which I wasn't planning to use. My flexible childcare arrangement made me feel as if 7 years with the company and a good relationship with my boss were paying off. The breastfeeding support group occurred in a room accessed by a curtained-off doorway at the rear of the boutique. Despite the swankiness of the boutique's merchandise, this room was filled with furniture whose best days had come and gone. 3 mismatched, stained couches and a handful of chairs formed a lopsided circle. Scattered about were those C-shaped pillows I'd believed until shortly before Sadie's birth were meant to alleviate the discomfort of hemorrhoids, but now knew were platforms for nursing babies. When I entered the room, 11 or 12 other women, all with infants, were chatting, about half of them with their breasts fully or partially displayed. Instead of being differentiated by their personalities, the women were differentiated by their nipples. I'd carried Sadie inside her cart seat, and I set it on the floor behind an empty chair along with her diaper bag and lifted her out. Mother-baby duos continued to trickle in as the support group's leader, a gorgeous and slender woman wearing a crocheted turquoise sundress, got things rolling. "I'm Nico," she said. "I'm the mom of Scarlett, who's 6 and has self-weaned, and Declan, who's 4 and loves breastfeeding. I'm passionate about helping moms like you give this beautiful, natural, and super healthy gift to your little ones." As with prenatal yoga, we were then supposed to go around and introduce ourselves. Gretchen went third, and after she'd said her name, she said, "And this is Piper, who was born via C-section after a grueling 26 hours of labor." I was like, "No drugs, no drugs." And Carl was like, "Gretchen, seriously, you're superwoman." But then there was an umbilical cord prolapse, so it was out of our hands. On the upside, Piper's nursing like a champ. "If your delivery didn't happen how you wanted, it's important to grieve," Nico said. "At the same time, don't underestimate how amazing it is that now you're literally sustaining her with your own body." The next person who introduced herself was named Jessica. Her baby was Ethan, and both of them began to cry as Jessica described how challenging Ethan's tongue tie made breastfeeding, which caused me to perk up with interest. Introductions were then stalled for 20 minutes as other mothers murmured support and a discussion of positions occurred. Nico was soon on her knees, crouched over Jessica, maneuvering Jessica's left breast, though she looked around at all of us as she said, "Breastfeeding shouldn't hurt. We wouldn't have survived as a species if it did, right? So if you're in pain, what it probably means is that you have a bad latch." Introductions never did get all the way around the circle, and the hour was finished. It concluded with Nico reading aloud a poem that rhymed lactation and revelation before I'd said my own or Sadie's name. I set my daughter back in her car seat, hoisted the diaper bag onto my shoulder, took all of us out to the car, and drove home, stopping on the way to purchase a 1.45-pound container of powdered formula. Fixing Sadie a bottle that afternoon felt at first like a transgression. And then, as she accepted it unfussily like a relief, I planned to alternate between formula and breast milk, but within a week, I stopped nursing altogether and was using my employee coupons to buy formula in bulk. Needless to say, I didn't return to this support group. The third place I crossed paths with Gretchen was in infant swim lessons. By that point, Sadie was 6 months old. The lessons occurred on Tuesday mornings, which was the day I worked from home, though my original plan to get things done while Sadie napped had been delusional and I'd basically given up on it. To seem productive, I sent frequent emails to my coworkers. Only 5 babies were enrolled in the swim class, but if Gretchen recognized me, she gave no sign of it. A strange intimacy existed between us as we stood in the water next to each other in our tank bathing suits, or took turns holding our babies in the center of the circle while singing "Purple potatoes and purple tomatoes and Sadie is in the stew." Yet Gretchen and I never spoke to each other directly. Piper seemed good-natured, and I assumed that she was still nursing like a champ, and that Gretchen was greatly enjoying not outsourcing her childcare. Then around the 4th class, Gretchen and Piper stopped showing up. The weird part was that I almost missed them. Without the tension created by my antipathies toward Gretchen, the half hour felt slack, and I realized for the first time I found the swim lessons boring. Another 3 months passed, during which my company laid off 1,200 employees, including my boss and 5 other people in my department. My new boss was a 26-year-old guy with an MBA. That is, he was 3 years younger than I was. And he told me that if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to work full-time and on-site. The next day, my mother-in-law, who'd been walking with a limp for 2 years, was approved by her orthopedist to have her hip replaced. Her recovery would last 4 to 6 weeks, and taking care of Sadie during that time was out of the question. It wasn't that I looked down on parents who put their kids in daycare. It wasn't that I disapproved of them, or at least if I did disapprove, I knew enough to be embarrassed by my disapproval. I wasn't a person compelled to broadcast my own choices in the hopes of making other people feel inferior. Nevertheless, on Sadie's first day at Green Valley Children's Center, I didn't even make it out the front door before I burst into tears. I hadn't felt that bad about some of the things that women having babies when I did, even in Omaha, were supposed to feel bad about. An epidural, formula. But the collapse of my carefully crafted childcare setup seemed like a failure of a different magnitude. Although Adam and I had planned to bring Sadie to daycare together, a last-minute meeting had been scheduled at his office, so I was alone. Blinded by tears, I pushed open the front door of the center and stood in the parking lot sobbing. I needed to get to my car to hide, but I was so flustered that I couldn't remember where I'd parked. And then someone's arms were around me. The someone was female, and her shampoo smelled like coconut, and she was saying, "It's your first day, right? I saw you doing drop-off upstairs, but don't worry because seriously, Green Valley is great. I was nervous too, but now I love it so much. It took several seconds of collecting myself and then of focusing on the woman's face. She was still embracing me, and we were almost too close together for me to see her, to realize the woman was Gretchen. I think she understood that I was recognized her, or perhaps I flinched, and she dropped her arms. She said, I don't know if you remember me, but we were in the same. I remember you. I wiped my nose with my left palm. I thought you were a stay-at-home mom. She laughed. Well, Carl left me in March, which kind of threw a wrench into things. Then she said, it turns out my husband was having an affair since before I got pregnant, and now I'm single and working full-time. Life is full of surprises, huh? I was taken aback and said nothing, and she added, really, though, I've been so happy with this place. I've learned a ton from the teachers. It was early July, almost a full year since Gretchen and I had met, although in a way we'd never met. Neither of our daughters had celebrated their first birthdays yet, and when I look back, our girls are 8 now, I'm struck by how that was still the beginning of them becoming themselves and of us becoming mothers. In the years since, Sadie and Piper have learned to tie their shoes and ride bikes and read. They've had croup and stomach flu. Their feelings have been hurt. They've lost teeth. They've performed in ballet recitals. I don't know if it's more improbable that Gretchen and I became each other's closest friends or that our daughters did too. Not that it's all been easy for any of us. I had 2 miscarriages before the birth of my son, and Gretchen got engaged again and subsequently called it off. Sometimes when I see photos of Adam that he took of me holding Sadie on the first month of her life, I can discern the faintly bumpy outline of cabbage leaves beneath my nursing bra, and I'm reminded of a particular kind of confusion that hasn't entirely disappeared, but has, with time, decreased. That morning, in the parking lot, I sniffled once more, then extended my hand to Gretchen. Hi, I said. I'm Rachel.
Hi, I'm Morgan Walsh, and this is A is Alone by Curtis Sittenfeld. Irene's medium, the one in which she has exhibited at galleries, is textiles, but for interrogating Graham/Pence, she decides to use Polaroid photos and off-white Tintoretto paper. Even though the questions will be the same for all the men, she handwrites them in black ink, because the contrast of her consistent handwriting with the men's varied handwriting will create a dialogue in which she is established as the interrogator. Before her lunch with Eddie Walsh, she writes, date, name, age, profession. When prior to lunch today did you last spend time alone with a woman who is not your wife? Are you aware of the Modesto Manifesto, also known as Billy Graham Rule, or known as the Mike Pence Rule? If so, what is your opinion of this rule? When I invited you to lunch, what was your reaction? She and Eddie are meeting at a Thai restaurant downtown. Unless it feels organically relevant, she plans to make no mention of the project until after the arrival of the check, which she will pay. Almost 30 years ago, as undergraduates at the U, Irene and Eddie both took Introduction to Ceramics. The studio featured 2 potter's wheels and was open until midnight. And Irene and Eddie spent many more hours there than was necessary, not because of each other, but because of the wheels. Over time, as they chatted intermittently, it emerged that both of them would have preferred majoring in studio art. Irene's major was product design and Eddie's was economics, and that neither of them had parents who would have been okay with this. Eddie had grown up on a farm in the southwest Minnesota, and Irene was a dentist's daughter from St. Cloud. In the ceramics studio in 1988, a white paint-splattered radio and cassette player sat on the sill of the huge window overlooking 21st Avenue, and stuck inside the cassette slot was Cat Stevens' Greatest Hits, turned to side 2. Though every so often a person more foolish or enterprising than Irene would attempt without success to remove it, she never tired of the songs. She and Eddie both took more ceramics courses. After graduation, they lived in group houses 2 blocks apart in the Kingfield neighborhood and regularly saw each other at parties. Eddie was affable, funny, and good-looking, and always had a serious girlfriend, the third of whom, a woman named Farah, he married. Following college, Irene was hired in product development at Target, and Eddie by an investment firm. Irene was 25 when she married Peter. They moved to Ann Arbor for him to attend medical school, then to Pittsburgh for his orthopedic surgery residency, and then to San Francisco for his fellowship. By the time they moved back to Minnesota, she was 35 and the mother of 7-year-old twin boys. Eddie had started his own investment firm. He and Farah had a daughter and a son and lived in a gigantic house out on Lake Minnetonka. Apparently, though, still affable, he had become enormously rich and successful. Outside the Thai restaurant, Irene runs into Eddie on the sidewalk and he hugs her warmly. After the embrace, she says, "Thanks for meeting me." And he says, "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine." She rolls her eyes. "Trump fine, shit show fine." "But," Eddie says, "you're healthy, you look good." "Oh God," she says, "did you think I was sick? I'm not sick." "Oh, no, it's great to see you. It was great to hear from you, but just, I didn't know, since it had been a few years." "Well, it hasn't been that long," Irene said. "Peter and I were at Beth's high school graduation party." "Well, Beth just started her senior year of college," Eddie says. So much for organic relevance. Irene says, "Do you know what the Billy Graham rule is?" "I don't think so." "A few months ago, there was an article about Mike Pence that got a lot of attention that said he follows it. That is, if you're a married man, you don't spend time alone with another woman." "Oh, I did hear about that." "I'm doing a mixed media project on it because after the article, there was this brouhaha among liberals about how ridiculous it is, that it's sexist, it blocks professional advancement for women, etc. But then I thought, how often am I alone with a man other than my husband? Almost never. I agree that the rule is ridiculous and sexist, yet I am functionally living in Mike Pence's world. So I decided to conduct an experiment where I invite men I know to have lunch with me without explanation, except that I'm explaining everything to you now. And afterwards, I take their picture and ask them to fill out a questionnaire. You're my first. "I'm so glad you didn't have stage 4 breast cancer." "That's weirdly specific." After a pause, Irene says, "Thanks, though. I'm glad, too." They enter the restaurant, are shown to a table, and order. For her, papaya salad and fried tofu. For him, massaman curry. She looks across the table at his kind, lined face and feels a fondness for him that turns out not to be incompatible with finding their conversation boring. Is the boredom a result of the inevitable come down following their emotional greeting, or a reflection of the topics they discuss? The tuck pointing he and Farah are having done to their house, his involvement in fundraising campaign for the U, what they hope for from the Mueller Mueller investigation, which of course is what any Democrat hopes for from the Mueller investigation. He insists on paying, and because of how rich he is, she acquiesces. Before the waiter brings back Eddie's credit card, Irene reaches into her bag for the Polaroid camera and the handwritten questionnaire, which is protected inside a linen folder. He fills it out in less than a minute, then grins gamely for the camera. The photo slides out. He says, "Now that you mention it, I'm rarely alone with a woman who isn't Farah." Gesturing across the table, he says, "For sure not like this, but professionally too. I guess it's because financial planning is a male-dominated field." "Where did you say your exhibit will be?" "Well, I'm not nearly that far along," Irene says. "I need to see how the project unfolds." Fleetingly, she wonders if he envies the fact she's still making art or if he considers her a chump. This is when, his expression thoughtful, he says, "I listen to a satellite radio station when I'm driving that plays, I guess you'd call it classics, And whenever a Cat Stevens song comes on, I think of the ceramic studio. I know, she says. A music version of Peace Train was playing the other day at the grocery store. They smile at each other, and he says, this was fun. Let's do it again soon with Farah and Peter. Farah is our designated calendar manager, so probably best if you email her. In her car, Irene reads Eddie's answers. Date, September 8th, 2017. Name, Edward Nicholas Walsh. Age, 49. Profession, co-founder, Walsh Ackelson Capital Group. When prior to lunch today, did you spend time alone with a woman who is not your wife? Professionally, sometimes at work with an associate named Megan, albeit usually not alone. Socially, can't even remember. 2015, 2008, 1995. Are you aware of the Modesta Manifesto, also known as the Billy Graham Rule, also known as the Mike Pence Rule? Not applicable. If so, what is your opinion of this rule? Seems weird. When invited to lunch, what was your reaction? Was worried. Glad you're good. Her original plan was to have lunch with a different man every week for a year. After making a list of plausible candidates, actual friends, acquaintances from the Twin Cities art world, long ago Target co-workers, neighbors and former neighbors, fathers of her son's friends, she realized that 52 was far too ambitious. She got to 21, but when she subtracted those with whom she suspected even an hour-long lunch would be intolerably awkward, the list dropped to 16. Of the 16, 2 were single, one divorced, one never married, and weren't single men exempt? Another 2 were gay, which raised a different question. Wouldn't Irene's ability not to fall in love with him and vice versa fail to rebut the threat of the omnipresent and unbridled heterosexual lust implied by Billy Graham rule? On the other hand, how in the year 2017 could she exclude anyone for being gay and not somehow be siding with Pence? She gave up on scheduling the lunches at even intervals. If she could recall spending time alone with a man in the past, no matter how long ago, she put an A next to his name. If he was gay, she put a G. If he was single, she put an S, though she decided against contacting single men unless not enough of the married ones panned out. In the mid-2000s, after Irene and her family moved back to Minneapolis, a man named Philip was the coach of her son's hockey team. His own son was also on the team. This was during a period when Irene decided to fight her natural aversion to group activities, and she often signed up to provide team snacks. The 7- and 8-year-old boys met 3 times a week. Irene didn't expect to like Philip, which maybe made it easier too. He was extremely patient and clear when explaining to the kids the rules of hockey and his own expectations. For lunch, they met at a grass-fed burger chain near the suburban office where he's an insurance adjuster. She arrives first, and when he joins her, she can immediately feel that he is confused, but that, unlike Eddie, he will not ask why she has summoned him. Either Philip is too reserved, or they don't know each other well enough anymore. As they make small talk about how their sons are doing at college, Philip sits stiffly, almost sideways, and doesn't smile. This confusion is, of course, the point, and yet she can stand it for only 5 minutes after they order. If the artist in her is fine inducing discomfort, neither the Midwesterner nor the woman in her is. So she says, "Did you wonder why I suggested getting together?" "I thought there'd be other people," he says. "Funny you should say that. Have you ever heard of the Billy Graham rule or the Mike Pence rule? It's that if you're a married man, you don't spend time alone with a woman because it's, inappropriate." At the same time, she rolls her eyes and he says, "Makes sense." She tries to remember if he's religious. She says, "But the rule applies across the board, personally and professionally. Don't you ever have a meeting with a colleague who's female? There's a difference between talking to someone in the office and going out for a drink. Do you remember that I'm a visual artist? I'm doing a project about the rule and people's views on it." "What does project mean?" He's squinting grimly. I don't want to be part of a Facebook post. No, it's not Facebook. And I wouldn't include anyone without their permission. I'm taking photos and having the participants fill out a questionnaire. Yeah, no, I'll take a pass, he says. Their food arrives, a turkey burger for him, a veggie burger for her. And after the waiter walks away, she says, "So, are you doing anything fun this weekend?" This is how they get through the next 20 minutes. She is blandly inquisitive. He is standoffish. And then she says, "Regarding my project, if you agree with the premise of the Mike Pence rule, that's interesting. It's interesting to feature some people who agree with it and some who don't. Would you be comfortable filling out the questionnaire anonymously?" I'll pass on that. I realize I'm violating the social contract here, but did you, in the election? Philip looks at her blankly and she says, "Are you a Trump supporter?" I don't care for the president's rhetoric, but Pence seems like a smart guy, good ethics, good leadership. Once in a third period of a tied hockey game, Irene's son Colin scored a goal against his own team. His team lost, and afterwards, while the little boys clustered off the ice and Colin blinked back tears, Philip calmly told the team that everyone made mistakes, and what mattered wasn't any particular moment or any one game, but how they played together over a whole season. At the restaurant, she says, "I wish I thought Pence was any better, but his homophobia, his abortion restrictions, plus the way he kowtows to Trump, I find it really scary." Philip says nothing, and she adds, "FYI, a lot of my extended family is conservative." Yeah, I'm not someone who argues about politics, Philip says. At home on her list, she writes "you" next to his name for unsuccessful. If Irene's life were a movie, it would be the third man she has lunch with who represents a breakthrough. The first two would be duds, and the third would change everything. But her life is not a movie. Still, although the third isn't life-changing, he is delightful. The man is Ken, her former boss at Target, now 68 years old, retired and living on White Bear Lake. He demonstrates none of Eddie or Philip's apparent need for justification for why he and Irene are in each other's presence. Instead, he's palpably pleased to see her, and the conversation is wide-ranging. His upcoming vacation to Bermuda, their former co-workers, a 600-page novel he just read, which he says left him sobbing at the end, and the very long story of a lawsuit filed by his adult niece against her sister based on the second niece's claim that their mother had given her an amethyst bracelet before her death, which the first niece said her sister had taken without permission. Irene enjoys very long stories involving lawsuits, sisters, and bracelets, and asks many follow-up questions. Is it relevant that Ken is gay? She has amended the questionnaire accordingly. While holding up the camera, you have a tiny bit of, she runs the tip of her tongue between her own left central and lateral incisors. Bless you, he says, and removes the kale remnant with his thumbnail. Date, 9/25/17. Name, Ken. Age, 68. Profession, retired in 2015 as Senior Group Director at Target. When prior to lunch today did you last spend time alone with a woman? I went for a walk over the weekend with my neighbor Sheila. When prior to lunch today did you spend time alone with a man who is not your husband? I had dinner last week with my friend Reggie at Aqua, which was delicious, by the way. Not good for the waistline, but a fantastic meal. Are you aware of the Modesto Manifesto, also known as the Billy Graham Rule, also known as the Mike Pence Rule? Pretending gay people don't exist won't make us go away. This administration is nothing but a bunch of bigots and bullies. If so, what is your opinion of this rule? Utter horseshit. Give 'em hell, Irene. When I invited you to lunch, what was your reaction? What a creative person you are. I'm proud to have been your mentor. Troy and Irene met 5 years ago when they both had work featured in an exhibit of local artists at a gallery in the Northeast. Troy's medium is metal sculpture, usually alloy steel. They hit it off on opening night after being cornered by a drunk gallery donor, and they began meeting every month or two for coffee, in addition to being one of the only Black men on Irene's list. Troy is 10 years younger, handsome and married to a woman named Gabrielle, who's a lawyer at a big downtown law firm. But Irene rarely sees him anymore. 18 months into their friendship, Troy won a MacArthur Fellowship, and suddenly he was never in Minneapolis. Instead, he was in Miami or New Delhi or London. When they meet at a sushi place uptown, Irene hasn't seen him for about a year. The first 15 minutes of their lunch are great. They gossip enthusiastically about the owner of the gallery where they met, who has just shared on Facebook that she's a nudist. But then they don't, as Irene had anticipated, and despite her efforts, segue into discussing work. This was always Irene's favorite part of having coffee with Troy, that they talked about the incremental progress of their art, his welding and her weaving, in such a nitty-gritty way that it might have been incomprehensible to a person overhearing. This time, when she asks about his current projects, he tells her that he's having a show at a major gallery in Manhattan, and also that he's looking for an assistant if she knows anyone. He asks her nothing about what she's working on, to such a notable extent that she wonders if he believes that doing so would be bad manners, now that his success has so overshadowed hers. Eventually, before taking his picture and requesting that he fill out the questionnaire, she describes interrogating Graham Pence. His expression is skeptical. "What?" she says. "Do you think it's a horrible idea?" "It all depends on the execution." "Right," she says, "of course. The part I'm not hearing is where it's transformative. Where's the alchemy? You have some Polaroids, some sheets of paper, and then what? It's regurgitation, not transformation." He's not wrong, but the way he's saying it, it's both practiced and distant, like there's some invisible but enormous audience, like he's giving a TED Talk titled, "Where's the Alchemy?" Sarcastically, she says, "Ha, thanks for the encouragement." And he says, "Hey, no one's rooting for you more than I am." As she waits for him to complete the questionnaire, it occurs to her that she may never, after this, see him one-on-one, that he won't initiate it, and neither will she. Date, October 4. Name, Troy Maxwell. Age, 39. Profession, artist. When prior to lunch today did you last spend time with a woman who is not your wife? Lunch yesterday with my agent in New York. Are you aware of the Modesto Manifesto, also known as the Billy Graham Rule, also known as the Mike Pence Rule? If so, what is your opinion of this rule? When I invited you to lunch, what was your reaction? Hang in there, Irene. Instead of answering the second and third questions verbally, Troy has drawn a self-portrait with one eyebrow raised, his lips pursed in scorn. This is almost endearing enough to make her think they'll remain friends after all. Man number 5 is Abe, the father of a boy named Harry, who is in elementary and middle school, was the best friend of both Irene's sons. Irene was unsure whether to put an A next to Abe's name because she was in fact been alone with him many times, but never by design. Before their friends could drive, she stood in all seasons at her door while Abe dropped off or picked up his sons at Irene's house, or she stood at Abe's door while dropping off or picking up her sons. They also stood next to each other, very much not alone, sometimes with Abe's wife Carla at the bleachers at ice rinks and on the sidelines of soccer fields, all of which is to say that she has no idea if she and Abe know each other well or barely. When Abe joins her at a chopped salad place near his office, his eyes fill with tears as he says he realizes Carla put Irene up to this, but that she, Irene, is a good friend to reach out. It soon emerges in such a way that it's clear he's unaware that she's learning it all in the moment, that 10 days ago in the basement of a fraternity at the University of Wisconsin, his son Harry attempted suicide. Harry has since entered an inpatient program for depression in the Twin Cities and is also confronting an opioid addiction, of which his parents previously had no inkling. Irene has the almost overwhelming impulse to call her own sons at their colleges to ask if they know about Harry and to confirm that they themselves are okay. For the duration of the lunch, she murmurs unoriginal but sincere expressions of sympathy, asks if there's anything she can do, inquires about the logistical aspects of Harry's program. She eats her entire salad, and Abe eats almost none of his. She paid for both of them after they went through the line at the counter, so there's no bill to signal the end of their time together. She retroactively decides that this was a lunch where she was checking on Abe and not just including him in interrogating. Not for the first time, it occurs to her that perhaps rather than exploring the customs of married heterosexual socializing, she is inadvertently demonstrating the isolation of modern life. As she drives home, she considers abandoning the project. In October, the Me Too movement attracts more widespread attention, which means that Irene's project has become more relevant or more unsavory, or both. She plans to explain the project up front to Jack, man number 6. Because of everyone who made the cut, she probably knows him the least well. Jack and his wife Lori are friends of friends. Every New Year's Eve, Irene and her husband attend a dinner party held by a couple on their street named Maud and Carl. Both of them political science professors currently on sabbatical in Prague. Jack and Lori, who don't live in the same neighborhood, are the other guests. Irene sent a joint email to Maud and Carl saying that if they were in town, she tried to cajole Carl into participating in her project and asking for Jack's email address. Carl replied, Irene, no cajolery will be required. Before supplying Jack's email, he described his recent visit to Prague's National Gallery. Maud replied, Carl and I regularly get coffee or a drink one-on-one with opposite-sex colleagues in our department. Nothing untoward happens, and not only is a certain extra energy part of these encounters, but that energy is important. Expecting one's spouse to supply the totality of one's mental and social stimulation is childish. On a more prosaic note, Irene, I see that the temperature in Minneapolis is dropping. Could you turn our heat on to 55 degrees? Irene has never been in direct individual contact with Jack. And though she has consistently enjoyed talking to him on New Year's Eve for the past 5 years, she has never seen him anywhere other than at her neighbor's house. He and his wife live in St. Paul, and Irene would have said he was an engineer, but she learns by Googling him that he's actually a geologist at an engineering consulting firm. She emails him and suggests meeting at a large brewery in Golden Valley that she knows is nearby his office. She always arrives at these lunches early, but then when she walks into the restaurant, he's already seated. He stands as she approaches, smiling broadly. It's such a pleasant surprise to hear from you, he says. After a tiny hesitation, they hug. He has ordered a beer, so she does too. Until now, the only man she drank with was Ken, with whom she had a glass of white wine. When the waiter departs, Jack gestures to his phone, which is set face down on the table, and says, I just read an article about a piece of paper Einstein wrote on getting auctioned off for $1.5 million. Apparently, he was staying at a hotel in Japan, and when he went to tip the bellboy, he realized he didn't have any money. So he wrote down his thoughts about happiness on some hotel stationery and gave it to the guy. Irene says, do I sound cynical if I say I bet the bellboy would have preferred the cash? Jack laughs. That occurred to me too, although this was right after Einstein learned he'd won the Nobel Prize. Well, then I suppose he was inhabiting his full Einsteinhood by then, Irene said, or close to it. Also, it's descendants of the bellboys who get the money from the auction. Does that mitigate things? Partly, but it's still so arrogant. It's 1 degree away from sneezing into a tissue and giving it to someone. Jack laughs again, takes a sip of beer, and says, speaking of genius types, from what I can glean on Facebook, it looks like Maud and Clara are enjoying Prague. Yeah, I'm in pretty close contact with Maud because I'm their house sitter. Are you really? Jack seems amused. Well, I have a studio above our garage and it literally overlooks their backyard, so it's not a big deal. But house sitting is a gig for a 15-year-old, and you're a famous artist. Ha! Irene says, I wish. She raises her eyebrows jokingly. Are you a big fan of woven textile design? You've had exhibits and stuff. Jack's expression becomes self-conscious. Yes, I've Googled you. Is that weird? I don't think in 2017 it's weird for anyone to Google anyone else. And you're probably right that my boys would do the house sitting if they weren't at college. Remind me, do you still have kids at home? Jack nods. Two of the three. Marissa's a sophomore at Carleton, Lacey is a junior in high school, and Annie is in sixth grade. Do you know what an artist colony is? I think so, but in case I don't, why don't you tell me? They're places where they're places where artists, including composers or writers, can stay for a few weeks or months and be undisturbed. They're often somewhere rural, and a chef prepares meals for you, and the only expectation is that you'll be productive. This might sound kind of preposterous, but for years I planned that when my kids went to college, I would give myself permanent residency at my own personal artist colony, as in without leaving home. I never applied for a real one because the time never seemed right. But I turned my entire life into, you know, Irene T. Larson Fellowship for being Irene T. Larson. Have you done it? Well, I'm the chef, but yes. He raises his beer and says, cheers. After they've tapped their glasses, he says, I don't know if you remember this, but last New Year's Eve, you recommended a Korean documentary to me. It was about old women sea divers. Irene doesn't remember mentioning it, though she does remember the documentary. He says, I found it very interesting if you have other recommendations. Well, I watch a documentary every day, so I could give you a list of my top 500 favorites. Do you really? Not on the weekend, but every weekday afternoon, usually just on Netflix. Is it part of the Irene T. Larson Fellowship for being Irene T. Larson? She laughs. One of the most important parts. Because of the surprising abundance of topics they have to discuss, there's no obvious moment to mention the project. She orders beet salad and he orders chicken salad and asks if she's a vegetarian. She is. And they talk about CSAs and a project he's been working on a site in northwestern Minnesota and more of what the job entails. When the bill comes, he grabs it and says, this is definitely my treat. Well, you should let me, and I'll tell you why. Do you know what the Mike Pence or the Billy Graham rule is? The men and women not being alone thing? Exactly. Which, well, my hunch is that you're not a Trump supporter. Jack rapidly shakes his head. I'm inviting men I know out for lunch, and if I'm being honest, I'm pretending to neutrally ponder the rule while really trying to highlight how dumb it is. But at the same time, I think it's a rule of straight married women unwittingly and married people unwittingly abide by. Oh, that's a great idea, Jack says. That's really interesting. Is he being sarcastic? He continues, I'm almost sure the last woman I saw one-on-one before today was a friend of my cousin Jessica who was about to move to the Twin Cities. We had coffee last spring. Hold that thought. If you don't mind, I have a questionnaire for you that asks about that. But was the coffee social or more of a professionally networking thing? Well, she was in town to look at houses, trying to get the lay of the land, neighborhoods, and schools. Have you seen each other since? Well, after a family moved, we had them over for dinner. I think what you're describing is the exception among people who don't purposely practice the rule, that you're allowed to meet with a person of the opposite sex once, and then if you see each other again, it's after you've been slotted into a category, whether it's couples, friends, or professional acquaintances. But a married man and a married woman can't form a new, entirely social friendship. Wow, Jack says. That's also depressingly heteronormative. But whatever the reason is, I'm happy to spend some time with you. You're one of the coolest people I know. She experiences a split second of confusion or unsteadiness before saying, my son Arlo recently told me people don't use the word cool anymore. He said everyone says awesome or dope. But he undermined the claim later because he used the word cool a few minutes after that. In that case, Jack says, what if I say instead that you're very witty and charming? She laughs. I promise I wasn't baiting you. Just out of curiosity, Jack says, what does Peter think of your project? I haven't mentioned it to him yet. Jack nods, though she has the sense that he is taken aback. She adds, Not for any particular reason. I just don't really discuss my art with him. Got it. Another part of the project is I'm taking a picture of each man I've lunched with. Are you okay with that? I should warn you, I look silly when I smile. As she pulls out the Polaroid camera from her bag, she says, "Did someone tell you that?" No, but I see pictures and think, what a goofball. She realizes while driving home that she forgot to have him fill out the questionnaire. She got distracted by talking about it, neglected to actually give it to him. She'll email him, she decides, and ask if they can meet up again for 5 minutes in the next few days, perhaps outside his office. After she pulls into her garage, she checks her phone, and an email from him is waiting. She left the restaurant 17 minutes ago, and he sent a message 10 minutes ago. Irene, it was very dope seeing you. Did I do that right? Let me know if you'd like to get together again. It would be an honor to offend Mike Pence's sense of decency with you anytime. Best regards, Jack. Instead of stopping by his office, he suggests that they meet the following afternoon at Worth Park. As she turns into the lot off Glenwood Avenue, he is leaning against the driver's door of his car with his arms folded. When he realizes it's her, he unfolds his arms and smiles. This time when they hug, again after a hesitation, it feels incredibly awkward. He gestures towards the Worth Lake and says, "Do you have time for a walk a bit? Time to walk for a bit?" She's not wearing ideal shoes. Perhaps shamefully, she took more care with her outfit than she had the previous day, and she has on heeled suede boots. Sure, she says. Although, do you mind filling out the questionnaire now, just so I don't forget again? She removes the paper from the folder and passes it to him, and as he presses it against the driver's side window, he turns his head and says warmly, "Have I mentioned how impressed I am that you figured out a way to go on dates with lots of men and have it count as work?" She hesitates for a few seconds and then says, "What's that supposed to mean?" "I know you're critiquing society and all that, but you have to admit that you found a clever loophole." She stares at him. "That's very insulting." "Oh, God." He looks genuinely distressed. "I was kidding. Oh, no, I'm really sorry. I just wanted to make you laugh." They're both quiet, and he adds, "Really, I'm sorry. I feel like a jerk right now." When she still says nothing, she honestly doesn't know what to say, he nods at the piece of paper and says, "What if I finish this, and while we walk, there's something I want to come clean to you about, some context." She swallows and says, "Okay." After he passes her his completed questionnaire, she slips it into the folder and slips the folder into her bag. They head towards the pedestrian path, and he says without preamble, "I've been very unhappy in my marriage for a long time. We did couples therapy, all that stuff, and I think we just have different personalities. But I can't see getting divorced with the kids still at home because, and I realize I'm not unbiased here, but I have a strong hunch that Lori would make a divorce ugly as possible, that she'd involve our girls. Lori isn't what you'd call even-keeled, nor is she big on boundaries. There came a point about 2 years into couples therapy where I thought, in order not to lose my mind, I need to give up hope on improving the marriage and accept it for what it is. This might sound defeatist, but she and I were on completely different wavelengths. This was also when I thought, if I ever have an opportunity to have a different kind of relationship with someone else, I'm going to take it. Cheating on my wife isn't who I plan to be, but I don't want to die without experiencing love again." They are passing an empty bench, not looking at each other, when she says, "And did you find someone else?" He says, "When I got your email, I thought maybe you were the person I'd been waiting for." She stops walking, and he does too. She is genuinely shocked. She says, "When was it that you decided you'd cheat if you could?" 6 or 7 years ago. "And during that time, how many people have there been?" "None. To be honest, I've never seen any kind of opening, nothing where it even felt like a possibility, and no one I was ever that attracted to other than very superficially. But it's not just that I got a random email from you and it got my hopes up. It's you, specifically. I'm sorry, this all sounds crazy, but there's one other part I need to mention. Do you remember the first New Year's Eve we all spent at Maud and Carl's? When we went around the table talking about what tattoos we'd get. Again, she does remember, but vaguely. People were saying things like their kids' names or a rose. I said the state of Minnesota. And then you told a story about visiting your grandmother in Ohio when you were 5 years old and jumping wildly on her bed. And that exact moment, an earthquake started. So when you stopped jumping, the entire house around you and all the furniture was shaking. You said the tattoo you'd get would be a seismogram of that earthquake. Irene laughs, but Jack's expression is earnest. He continues, someone at the table said, you must have been afraid of your own power. And very matter-of-factly, you said, no, I'm just disappointed that it hasn't happened again. I was sitting across from you, and you were wearing a dark blue dress that showed your collarbone and a silver necklace with an oval pendant, or whatever those things are called, and I was just overwhelmed. He's regarding her with a great questioning intensity. This is all still astonishing, every part of it. She glances away before looking back at him, and he says, but what about you? If you tell me your marriage isn't broken like mine, I wouldn't, well, I'll still feel the same about you, but I'd respect that. After a few seconds, she says, when I was in my 20s, I took pride in not seeing life romantically. I don't think I expected Peter to be, smitten with me. We met after he applied to out-of-state medical schools while he was waiting to hear which he'd been accepted by, and I married him almost for the reason someone decides to be a foreign exchange student. It was very important to me to not be a person who'd only ever lived in Minnesota. She smiles a little and says, that's horrible, right? Were you smitten with him? It was more like we both saw each other as reliable. Something I was naive about was how much he'd work. Even now, he works 75 or 80 hours a week. And when the boys were little, living in cities where we had no family, it was so hard having twins. Peter and I hadn't decided ahead of time that I quit my job, but it made no sense to keep it. What about now? Do you guys do things together? Do you sleep in the same room? If this is a euphemism for sex, she ignores it. And she says, because of how much he works, he's very protective of his Sundays. We have a tandem bike, and we go out for long walks. Or in the winter, he likes to skate on the Lake of Isles. Is he supportive of your art? He's someone who thinks in terms of things like bone fractures. So if I say I'm making a fiber installation about the 1878 mill explosion, of course that seems kind of ridiculous to him. But he doesn't tell me not to make art. Jack looks appalled. And she tells herself that she is kidding. Irene adds, do you still think you want to have an affair with me? What he says is as undefended a way as anyone has ever said anything to her, is, I'd love to have an affair with you if you want to have one with me. Later, when they are having an affair, neither one of them says having an affair, nor do they use the term cheat, in spite of the ostensible cultural consensus that that's what they're doing, is slimy. The words they use with each other are sweetest. The words they use with each other are the sweetest she's used with anyone besides her children. My beloved, my precious darling, I adore you, I miss you, I love you so much. The cliches they enact are no less potent for being cliches. They meet in hotels and occasionally in one of their cars in a scheduled parking lot. They communicate via an app she had not previously heard of, which automatically deletes their messages within an hour. She becomes obsessed with her phone. She pauses, interrogating, even canceling the lunch she had already scheduled with a man with whom a decade ago she volunteered at a food bank. She and Jack spend exponentially more time discussing their first lunch and their meeting by Worth Lake than they actually spent having lunch or walking around the lake. Repeatedly, they recount what they were thinking, what they thought the other person was thinking, which of their own remarks they felt most foolish about, and which of the other person's remarks they were most enchanted by. At first, they see each other once a week, but they grow greedier and more reckless. And once before Christmas, it is 4 times in a week. And once in January, It is during a weekend. They don't have to worry about New Year's Eve at Maud and Carl's with their spouses because Maud and Carl are in Prague until the summer. In February, when Irene's car is rear-ended a block from the Millennium Hotel on Nicollet Avenue, she thinks, this is it. The jig is up. Her secret ruined. But when, in order to explain why a loaner car from the Volvo repair place is in their garage, she tells Peter that she was in a fender bender, he doesn't ask her where, let alone why she was in that part of the city at that time. He doesn't ask her anything. Instead, the jig is up. Her secret joy ruined after Irene emails Jack an article about the auctioning of a note Albert Einstein wrote to a young female scientist. Irene gives the email the subject, Our Patron Saint. The body of the email contains a link to the article and the single sentence, I can't wait to smother you with kisses on Tuesday. This email arrives while his laptop is open on the kitchen table, and his wife Lori reads it before he does and confronts him. In addition, she calls their oldest daughter at college to describe what has happened. Jack weeps while telling Irene by phone that they must end things. They both say they don't blame each other. Why did she email him the article? Well, because she doesn't know how to send a link on the app. But why did she realize emailing was a bad idea? And they both say they'd do it again, even given how it's turned out. Irene and Peter's understanding is that if he's home from work by 8:30, they eat dinner together. But if he gets home after that, she eats without him. At 9:15, he enters the house, washes his hand, reheats the plate of moussaka she had set aside, eats it, wipes his mouth with a napkin, and then says, I got a phone call today at the hospital from Lori Deal. Whatever you're doing, you need to knock it off. Immediately. Up to this point, when it comes to Peter, she has alternated between guilt and astonishment at what, for almost 25 years, she has settled for. That night, she feels mostly numb, but also ashamed. Does Peter know about the smothering with kisses sentence? Does Lori and Jack's oldest daughter? For 2 nights, Irene sleeps on the couch in her studio. Then she and Peter proceed as if nothing has happened. She and Jack communicate a little more and have an overwrought conversation in his parked car, but it actually has ended. He tells her that he and Lori are re-entering couples therapy. If he wanted to leave Lori, Irene would leave Peter. But Jack has never wavered about not wanting a divorce. And though she considers leaving Peter anyway, she decides against it. She is certain that, money-wise, he'd dispassionately and meticulously fuck her over. She would no longer have a residency, a studio, health insurance. The spring is terrible, intolerable. The summer even more so for how lovely the weather is. The pleasant temperatures and sparkling lakes. How strange to think of Jack living his life such a short distance away in his house in St. Paul, 10 miles from her house. His office in Golden Valley, just 5. Irene keeps expecting the interlude when she met up with him 2 or 3 times a week. The exhilaration and closeness to seem like a fever dream, but it keeps seeming real. She remembers it clearly. Several months after their contact is ended, one late morning in her studio, she comes across the photos and questionnaires from interrogating. She read Jack's responses after their walk by Worth Lake, but she doesn't remember them, probably because she was so agitated that day. November 6, 2017. Name, Jack D. Age, 50. Profession, geologist. When prior to lunch today did you last spend time alone with a woman who is not your wife? As I mentioned at coffee with my cousin's friend last spring. Are you aware of the Modesto Manifesto, also known as the Billy Graham Rule, also known as the Mike Pence Rule? Yes. If so, what is your opinion of this rule? I am not on board with it, but it would be disingenuous to pretend I don't understand the logic. When I invited you to lunch, what was your reaction? I was very excited that I got to see you. She wants his questionnaire to impart some central truth, to give her closure. And while it's nice, the niceness pales in comparison with what he said moments after filling it out. It's you specifically, or the many ardent declarations of devotion in the months that followed. In early August, Maud and Carl returned from their sabbatical, And on the patio of a wine bar, Irene confesses everything to Maud. I still have no idea, Irene says. Does all of this officially vindicate Billy Graham and Mike Pence? Or does it mean that even a stopped clock is right twice a day? Maud's expression is contemplative and not scandalized. There are, what, almost 8 billion people on Earth, she says? It's so odd that you've decided Mike Pence either does or doesn't get to tell you how to live your life. The end. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much for reading that, Morgan. That's lovely. It's a beautiful piece, but it's not easy to read, and you did a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure. Loved your story as well.
Well, she's a great author, and I'm glad we could present her. And believe it or not, we're going to go farther afield next month. We're going to be presenting a couple of stories by Robertson Davies, who was a longtime professor at a college in Toronto. It's a college, Massey College, which is like the Canadian equivalent of Cambridge. And he wrote ghost stories for every Christmas celebration at that college. And they're pretty good, got to tell you. And we've got a couple of very good readers, and I hope you enjoy them. And I want to thank, once again, Thunder River Theater for giving us this opportunity. Morgan, I look forward to seeing you in person once we start being back at the library, which I think will probably be in April.
Great. I'll look forward to it.
Yay. Thank
And
you.
Sean, thanks.